Today we're going to be talking about all those kings, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and some of the early events that happened after the division of the kingdom. I wanted to talk just very briefly about apologetics. If you've attended any of the classes I've done in the past, you know that my thrust is not theological so much as it's apologetics. Apologetics is the academic discipline of confirming and validating and I hate to use the word proving the Bible, but showing that the Bible is historically correct. And the Book of Kings is a remarkable and wonderful tool to do that, because there are many people and many events that are mentioned in the Book of Kings that we can find mentioned in external documents, Egyptian, Assyrian, Babylonian documents. And not only do they mention the same people and the same events, but they also give us years for when these things happened. So it's a wonderful apologetic tool, and as we work through this, I'm going to show you bits and pieces of the evidence, at least to confirm the events that happen in the Book of Kings. Incidentally, the Book of Kings is not two books, it's one book. It was written as one book. Same with Samuel and Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. They were written as single books, and at the time they were composed, books were not books as we understand them. They were called that, but they were sheets of writing that were stitched together edge to edge into a long scroll and then rolled up from both sides. And you would open them and you could work your way through. When the Bible was translated into Greek, about 200 years before Christ, there were Jews all over the world who didn't speak Hebrew anymore. They were in Babylon and they were in Alexandria and places like that, and they didn't speak Hebrew. They wanted their Bible in a language that they spoke, which was Greek. Alexander had come through and conquered everybody, just as we read our Bible in English rather than Hebrew. And when it was translated into Greek, the people who did so, creating what's called the Septuagint, that's the Greek translation, they cut it in half right in the middle, made two books out of each of those because the scrolls were so big. So they made two smaller scrolls. And if you want to see how they did it, if you go to a Bible that has no footnotes, not a study Bible, just the text, go to the book of 1st and 2nd Kings and hold the two of them, you'll find they are exactly equal in size. Same with Chronicle. That's why when you go from 1 Kings to 2 Kings, it doesn't seem to make sense. They kind of cut it at a funny spot. They just cut it right in the middle to make two smaller scrolls. So anyway, as we work through Kings, I'll be showing you the various bits of evidence that are helpful in confirming the Bible. I wanted to show you very briefly what it is our young people are faced with when they leave high school and head off to college. Some of you may be familiar with the name William Deaver. He has written numerous books. The New York Times loves him. He's Professor Emeritus of Archaeology at the University of Arizona. This particular quote comes from a book called What Did the Bible Writers Know and When Did They Know It? And this is what he says. There was no ancient or biblical Israel. These are all late intellectual constructs forced upon an imagined past by centuries of Jewish and Christian believers. In other words, those of us that would argue that the Bible is historically correct are making up stories that are being forced upon everybody else, and that, he goes on to say, the Bible is a pious fiction, not historical fact. This is what we get outside of the church. You know, we sit here in the church among our believers, and we study what Jesus said and what's the effect for us and what does it mean for us. But when our young people head off to college, this is what they're faced with. And as a result, so many of our college students are simply losing their faith because they don't know how to respond to these types of arguments. And there are very good arguments to respond to these, and that's called apologetics. So that's what we're going to be looking at as we work through this class. A question was asked last week. The divided kingdoms of Judah and Israel, how do they compare to what Solomon controlled and the modern state of Israel? So I thought I'd take a moment and show you some maps. At the time of the birth of Muhammad, the entire Mediterranean was a Christian enclave because the Romans controlled all of it. Muhammad died in the early 600s, and within a couple of generations, his faith, Islam, had spread pretty much throughout the whole middle of the world, all the way from Spain and North Africa, all the way through northern India. These are not all Arabs. These are Egyptians and Turks and all different cultures, just as Christian believers today are all different cultures. But the spread of Islam was stopped in half a dozen places. A few of these are up in France in 732. There was a huge battle that was fought by the grandfather of Charlemagne. He stopped the Muslim thrust into Europe. The Crusaders took over for 100 years on the east coast of the Mediterranean. There was a major expansion that was stopped around Constantinople at that time, and then another major attempt by Suleiman the Magnificent to break into Europe, and he was stopped at the Battle of Malta in 1565. So they stopped them at that point, but shortly thereafter, a group of people called Ottoman Turks took over what would be the Holy Land, including what would become the State of Israel. They controlled it for about 400 years until World War I. And at the end of World War I, the Turks had lost, and the Western powers came in and had to decide what are they going to do with the territories controlled by the Ottoman Turks. And they did it fairly arbitrarily, sometimes on a map with a ruler and just drawing lines, which is why we have all the modern Middle Eastern problems that we have today. But if we take a look at that area, basically what they did is they returned a nation of Turkey, a nation of Iran, and a nation of Egypt, roughly in territories that they had occupied before. But the question still remained, what do you do with all of the Fertile Crescent, all of the biblical lands? And what they decided was that the people of those lands were not sophisticated enough at that point to be able to govern themselves, and they needed to be under the supervision of the British and the French. And when they finally achieved sufficient sophistication to have self-governance, they would then be returned to nations. And they created two what are called mandates, the British and the French. The French turned their mandates over shortly after World War II, and they created the nations of Syria and Lebanon. Meanwhile, the British continued on through World War II with the nation of what would become Iraq eventually, and then that area right there, which is modern Jordan and Israel, was called the Mandate of Palestine. Now, there never had been a nation of Palestine. There never were Palestinian people as a culture. That's a term that was applied to that part of the world back in Roman times. And if you look at the historical documents, there's no precise border for Palestine. It's kind of like the Middle East or the Midwest or the Southwest in the United States or the New England. There are different versions of what those are. And that's what Palestine was. It was a region. And the people who lived there are referred to as Palestinians, but it's not a culture. It's not a people that had their own nation at one point. And they eventually divided the Mandate of Palestine into two parts, Transjordan and Palestine. Palestine being what is roughly where Israel is today, Transjordan meaning across the Jordan River. It's over there. That's Eurocentric. If you're in Europe and looking eastward, Transjordan's over there. And then in 1948, the UN decided to create the State of Israel with what's called the partition, and they created this most bizarre map of a country that at that time was basically indefensible. It was a very narrow coastal region and then very arid southern portion and then the Galilee area to the north, but it would be very easy to cut the nation into two parts. Today it's a little different. You have missiles and planes and so forth. But at that point, they created the nation of Israel and Transjordan, and Jerusalem was to be an international city, ostensibly, accessible to everybody. And Transjordan called themselves Jordan now, but they also had some territory on the west side of the Jordan River, and so that was called the West Bank. And the West Bank at this point has basically broken away. That's the portion that wants to become Palestine as a nation. And then you have the nation of Israel, which is occupying the West Bank at this point because of the various wars. They had wars in 48 and 67 and 73. And territories have changed, and you know what the politics are at this point. But the territory that was controlled by Solomon is roughly that. They controlled territory on the east side of the river and on the west side, a very large kingdom that controlled the trade routes going through. Now, when that broke up and they created the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah, it was basically territory on the west side of the Jordan River. And then, of course, Israel was destroyed by the Assyrians, and the Babylonians destroyed Judah. And so what we have at that point is a series of conquerors that controlled that area, starting with the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the Persians, and then the Romans, and then the Muslims, and then the Crusaders, and then some more Muslim nations, the Ottoman Turks, and then finally today we have the independent state of Israel after 2,000 years. So that's basically the maps, and I wanted to spend a couple of minutes going over that because it is a bit confusing. Okay, apologetics, the high places. The Bible talks about high places repeatedly throughout this period of history. A high place was a place of worship, a shrine. It could be a temple. It could be huge standing stones. It could be little standing stones. The original high places were high places up at the top of the hills, because that's where the gods resided. As time passed and they started building little roadside shrines, those took on the name of high places as well. And this place at Dan, there are some wonderful high places that you can still see, these little roadside shrines. They weren't ever destroyed. The city of Dan is an archaeological treasure. It's one of my favorite places. So I thought I'd show you a couple of high places. These are the reconstructed walls at Dan. And those are Iron Age walls that date to the time of Jeroboam and later. So this is the city of that era. If you go around the corner there, you come to the courtyard and the entrance leading into the city. And you can see the gate over in the corner. And if the gates were reconstructed, they'd probably look something like this. And if you had to attack the city, you'd attack at the gates, because that's the weakest place. They didn't have siege equipment. And so that's why Uriah the Hittite, the husband of Bathsheba, David sent word, put him in front of the gates where he will be, and then have him stand in front of the gates where the fighting's the fiercest, and then withdraw all of his protection and leave him exposed. He would have been fighting in front of a gate like that. Now, just inside the gate, right down in a courtyard, just on the other side of the wall, is a high place. And these high places are pagan, little pagan shrines, because Dan was a very cosmopolitan city. The trade routes went through there, and all the pagan cities to the north and the south would be passing through there doing trade and so forth. And of course, you have the sin of Jeroboam, and so they would have allowed anybody to put their little altars up. And here's one right here. Now, the walls would have been plastered, and those 5 stones right there are standing stones at a high place. There would have been a priest there, and you would have given him an offering and discussed whatever particular god or gods these stones represent. If you walk a little bit further in Dan, you go through another set of gates, and over in the back of that area, before you start up the hill, there's another high place. And this is a little more elaborate. You can see it right there, just kind of an alcove shrine. A couple of steps leading up, there's a water basin in there. There would have been a priest, and as you walk by, you would make your offerings to whatever god that represented. And there are about 5 of those in Dan that are kind of fun as you walk through, and they're still intact. So that's a high place. This is the ultimate high place at Dan, right up on top. I showed you this last week. This is where the sin of Jeroboam was practiced. It's absolutely chilling to stand up there, read the Bible, and know this is where Jeroboam had his worship. There would have been a temple of some sort on the platform there, on the foundations, and then the altar would have been either cut stones or uncut stones. I mentioned last week, I don't know which way they would have done it. The Israelites used uncut stones. But the pagan world used ashlars. They'd cut their stones into nice cubes and then stack them up and make a very clean, neat-looking altar. So whatever it was, this is where Jeroboam initiated his faith up at Dan. The question that I want to mention at this point, is there any hard evidence for King David? Up until about 1990, the word David as the name of a man or a king could not be found in any ancient documents other than the Bible. We didn't have any proof that King David was a real person, and that was used as a very strong argument by Bible critics. There's no such thing as David. He's a fiction like King Arthur. You may have heard that. It's on the internet all the time. Well, in 1993, they found these three, well, actually, they found one piece in 1995, but in the wall at Dan, while they were excavating, they found these pieces of broken stone with writing on them. A stone with writing is invaluable because it gives us information. Pieces of pottery, foundations, we can make conclusions, but when you see a written stone, it provides us with information. And this particular one touched off a firestorm because, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit later in a couple of other classes, but these two words right there, written in ancient Aramaic, those words right there translate to House of David. And, of course, the argument for the next, well, actually 5 or 6 years was whether the House of David is a house that was owned by a man named David or whether this represented David the king. But as we work it through, and I'll show you this later on, I just wanted to introduce you to it, this refers to a dynasty from a king named David, and this was written less than 100 years after the death of Solomon. So already, just 2 or 3 kings later, there was a recognition. This was written by an Aramean king. This was written by Israelite people. This was written by enemies. They were acknowledging that there was a man that they killed who was of the house of David, of the lineage of David, of the dynasty of David. And so now this is pretty much accepted as our first and possibly our only mention of David outside of the Bible. Strong apologetic tool, though. Okay, let's go back to the sin of Jeroboam. It says, Jeroboam made 2 golden calves, and he said to the people, "Here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt." One of my questions, as far as the text, is there is never a mention made of the name of these gods. Every other pagan god had a name: Baal, Ashtoreth, Astarte. And there is no mention of the names of these, and my always humble opinion is that probably the author of these passages didn't want to dignify the faith and offer a name. He simply said pagan gods. So anyway, he says, "Here are your gods," and he made one in Bethel and one in Dan. That was the sin of the house of Jeroboam. House of Jeroboam, you see, the royal collection of people, house of David. The sin of the house of Jeroboam that led to its downfall and to its destruction from the face of the earth. We are then told, after he created this and created his own priests and his own altars and his own faith and literally drove the Levites south back to Judah, his wife went to meet with a prophet named Ahijah, because her son was sick. And so she wanted to go and talk to the prophet and see if perhaps he had some answer or perhaps tell her what was to be expected. And Ahijah was warned by the Lord. He was blind, but he was saying that the wife of Jeroboam is going to come and talk to you, and here's what I want you to tell her. Go tell Jeroboam through his wife that this is what the Lord says, and this is the message he gave her. You have done more evil than all who lived before you. You've made for yourself other gods, idols made of metal. And because of this, I will burn up the house of Jeroboam as one burns dung until it is all gone. You know, they use dung for fuel, especially out in the desert, camel dung. You dry it out and it burns, and you're carrying your fuel with you where you don't have trees and so forth. But we're going to burn you up, like you're going to destroy the house of Jeroboam. And then he goes on to say, this is not the Lord talking, this is Ahijah talking, but he says, the Lord will uproot Israel from this good land and scatter them beyond the river, because they provoked the Lord to anger by making Asherah poles. Beyond the river means the Euphrates, the northern end where the edge of Syria comes down right next to where Israel would be located. That's the Euphrates River, and that was typically about as far north as any of these. That was always a geographical boundary. But this is a prophecy that was fulfilled a couple of hundred years later when the Assyrians came in. And an Asherah pole, we don't know what those were particularly. They were, to our best understanding, kind of like a totem pole, a piece of maybe something about the size of a telephone pole, cut off maybe 6 or 8 feet high and then carved into some kind of a figure out of wood, and typically associated with a goddess, Asherah, for example. And so they were making these little goddess statues everywhere out of wood, the Asherah poles. What is often overlooked, though, with a casual reading of the Bible is that Judah down south, which had Jerusalem, it had the temple, that's where Rehoboam was king, they also fell away. Now, many of them already had by the time of Solomon. Remember, Solomon brought in these terrible kings, and he himself worshipped Moloch, who was one of the worst, demanded human sacrifice in the form of babies usually. Terrible. You'd throw the babies into the fire. But if Solomon had worshipped pagan gods, so would the people in his administration, at least openly. I mean, you do what your leader does if you want to keep your job. And if the ruling class in Jerusalem was worshiping pagan gods, then so would the people of Jerusalem and many people in the countryside. In other words, the influence of Solomon extended far beyond his own personal life. And so many of these people of Judah eventually fell away as well, and the Bible tells us this. It says the priests and Levites from all their districts throughout Israel came to Judah and Jerusalem because Jeroboam and his sons had rejected them as priests of the Lord. Now, this is a little confusing with all the Israels and Judah and so forth. When it says throughout Israel, they're talking about the new kingdom of Israel up north. The Levites were up there to lead religious observances. You may recall that back on Mount Sinai, all of the tribes, well, actually after the conquest, all of the tribes were given a region in which they could settle, but the Levites were not. The Levites had been selected to be the keepers of the religion, and one particular branch of the Levites, Aaron and his descendants, were to be the priests. All of the other people of the Levite group, the Levite family, were to be the keepers of the faith. They were the ones that carried the tabernacle and the ark when they were traveling, and they were the ones that took care of the temple when it was built. And rather than have a territory in which they lived, they were scattered all over the land. Every tribal allotment was given a town and some regions for the Levites to live in and support themselves. If I were going to make a modern comparison, it's a little bit like a Roman Catholic priest. You know, he goes into a town and he has a house, he's given a house and an income, and they move around. Well, these Levites are all over the north, and they're no longer welcome. Jeroboam created a new faith, and basically they all left and went south, where they assumed people would still be worshiping Yahweh, still be worshiping the Lord. That's where the temple was. That was Jerusalem. And it says Jeroboam and his sons had rejected them. So they went south, and it says they supported Rehoboam, son of Solomon, 3 years, walking in the ways of David and Solomon during this time. In other words, they reverted back to the faith of Yahweh. They continued their religious observances, but it says for 3 years. What happened after 3 years? Well, after Rehoboam's position as king was established and he had become strong, he and all Israel with him abandoned the law of the Lord. In other words, when the kingdom broke up, he didn't know whether he was going to retain his throne. But a few years later, he had solidified his hold. He had control of his kingdom, and so now he reverted back to his natural instincts, which was pagan worship. And that's understandable because his daddy had been that way. He grew up under Solomon. Solomon's worshiping all these terrible pagan gods, and that's exactly what Rehoboam did. He and all Israel. Now, in this case, they're not talking about the northern kingdom. They're talking about the Israelite people down in Judah. So you have to know the playbook. You know, when they talk about Israel and Israelites, you have to know whether they're talking about the kingdom or the people or the big nation or the little nation or whatever. But this is the southern kingdom reverted to paganism Again, after the example, I'm guessing, of Solomon. As soon as Rehoboam felt secure, then he could go back and stop perhaps pretending to be supporting Yahweh. He and all Israel abandoned the law of the Lord. What did they do? Well, they set up high places. All these little shrines, any gods they wanted. They could set up little shrines. They set up sacred stones and Asherah poles, these little wooden statues, and on every high hill and under every spreading tree. Groves of trees were regarded as sacred because there weren't a lot of groves of trees in this part of the world, and they'd be green and lush, and you read about trees repeatedly through the Old Testament as being centers of worship. But what were their practices? Male shrine prostitutes in the land. The people engaged in all the detestable practices of the nations the Lord had driven out before the Israelites. In other words, when they were coming into Canaan, God says, here are all the things those Canaanites are doing, destroy them, and that's what they were reverting to, the very practices that they were told to destroy. And that's because pagan worship practices are very seductive. They're very earthy, very sensual, ritual prostitution, all of the things that appeal to the baser instincts of people. And unfortunately, we are, I think, engaged in the same kind of battle with the internet. Every kind of vile behavior is available on the internet, and we're already talking about the people who are addicted to various aspects of the internet. That's what this was. That's what pagan worship was. Now, because they had been unfaithful to the Lord, Shishak, king of Egypt, attacked Jerusalem in the 5th year of King Rehoboam. This is very important apologetically. Rehoboam took the throne, behaved in a reasonable fashion for 3 years, reverted to paganism, and 2 years later he was attacked by Shishak of Egypt. And the northern kingdom of Israel was attacked as well, but the Bible doesn't tell us that. We learn that later on. It says that Shishak carried off the treasures of the temple of the Lord and the treasures of the royal palace. He took everything. What this was, since Jerusalem was not destroyed, it looks as though he was being paid off. He shows up at Jerusalem with his army. He's been sacking most of the country, and he was given a ransom, basically, and withdrew with all the treasure. We know from Egyptian records that Shishak then went back to Egypt and died shortly thereafter, and all of this loot that he had was used by his son to engage in huge building practices down in Egypt. They were using the treasures of Israel and Judah to build up buildings in Egypt. We know this because Shishak of the Bible has been identified as Shishak the First, 22nd dynasty in Egypt. If you take away the vowels in Shishak and Shishak, basically it's the same word. And those are the kinds of things that you can do to identify somebody who's mentioned in the Bible and somebody who's mentioned in another document, Egyptian or Assyrian. Sometimes it's not so easy. We know that Shishak, according to Egyptian documents, attacked Israel and Judah, as the Bible says, and he did that in 925 BC. Well, that's neat. Why is that so neat? Well, first of all, we have evidence of that at a place called the Bubasite portal. That was his family name. It's the Bubasite dynasty. At the Temple of Amun in Egypt, he created this door with all these reliefs and inscriptions on it. It's still there today. It's in kind of a state of disrepair, but to give you a sense of the size of that door, there's a man standing right there. I mean, we're talking about a huge wall with this relief on it showing the Pharaoh, and at the bottom of the relief, all the way across the bottom, we have rows and rows of these cartouches with names in them, and those are all the names of the little towns in Israel that he attacked in sequence, so we can actually follow his campaign through the country. And basically, you can reconstruct it this way. He traveled up and set up a base camp down in the southern corner. And then there are arguments about whether he sent 2 or 3 armies out or one army that went around. But we know the sequence of the towns, including Jerusalem. And then he also has a series of towns that were listed up in Israel. So we know he attacked throughout the whole country. Now, who's Shishak? Shishak is the fellow that gave asylum to Jeroboam. Remember when Jeroboam was being attacked by Solomon, he fled down to Egypt to Shishak the king? Shishak probably knew that this was going to be a chaotic period. Solomon is dying. There's going to be fighting over what to do with the kingdom, so he gave asylum to Jeroboam, probably to keep him alive so that he could continue the chaos. And then a few years later, when the two kingdoms are fighting each other, then he takes his army up and goes after them. It makes a whole lot of sense. And why is it important? It's because the Egyptian records tell us that the campaign of Shishak was in 925. And the Bible tells us that the campaign of Shishak was 5 years after the death of Solomon. So what can we conclude from that? We know when Solomon died. Solomon died in 930 BC. This is the earliest date that we have in the Bible today. If you look at that chronology in the back of your Bible with the times for everything else back to Abraham and Adam, those are all calculated numbers that have no basis in historical confirmation, except for one new discovery that's just been made, and that's the destruction of Sodom by Dr. Collins. We now have another date back there, and it shows, unfortunately, that all these other dates are wrong. But the point is, the earliest date that we have in the Bible up until just a couple of years ago was the death of Solomon. That's 930. We know Jerusalem was destroyed in 586. We now have a window of time. We have to fit all the kings of the divided kingdom into this little window. And we'll talk about that next time. So anyway, this is a very, very strong apologetic tool. We now have an event in the Bible confirmed by Egyptian document. Next week, we're going to actually talk about some of those bad and ugly kings. And there were a bunch of them up north. They were all bad. And maybe not physically ugly, but behaviorally speaking, they certainly were. And so you're not going to want to miss it. And anybody have any questions? Anything we want to talk about?
Okay,
Yes, the question was a wall with David's name on it. I think they were referring to this stone, the Tel Dan stone that was found in Dan that has the name of David on it. But that wasn't found until 1993. And it wasn't accepted as a mention of the dynasty of David until several years later. In fact, if you go back and look at articles in that period of time, there were lots of people who simply didn't want the name of David to be identified and found. Now, as an aside, I didn't show you this, but on that wall of Shishak, there is one small cartouche that's down in the southern part of Israel, and it's called it's damaged a little bit, but it looks like it says the Heights of David. And if that's the case, that very well may be the city that was given by David when remember he was a mercenary for the Philistines when he was fleeing from Saul. He had no place to hide in Israel. He actually went down and worked for the Philistines for a year and a half, pretending to be a supporter of them. And they gave him a city, a little town. And if that's the Heights of David, well, then we have two mentions of him. But that's kind of controversial. At this point, it's that one inscription. And that was written by an Aramean king who had conquered Dan and put up this little, it's called a stela. It's like a little tombstone that's flat, and then they engrave on it. And eventually that got broken apart, and the broken pieces were used to help build a wall later on. Yes, the question is, were there people who persisted in their faith, even in the face of the pagans? And the answer is yes, there always were. In fact, if you read through the book of 2 Kings and you follow the history of the kingdom of Judah, you'll find that it reverts to paganism, then reverts back. Under Hezekiah, there's a revival, and under Josiah, there's a revival. And so there were always people who believed, and sometimes they were in the majority, and apparently sometimes they were not, and subjugated to the created problems from the pagans. Just as a quick comment, how you deal with atheists or skeptics. There are different kinds of atheists and skeptics. There are the ones who are agnostic. They think there's a God, but they're not sure, and you can talk with them and say, here's the path. There are those who are atheistic because they've been told certain things that are not true, but they've not been informed by the events that are supportive of the Bible, and they have an open mind. And then there are the ones who are the screamers, that if you see them on the internet or if you look at comments, they're the ones that call the Christians names and ridicule them and try to shut them down. You can't talk to those people. And unfortunately, there are a lot of them out there, and they do have a platform today on the internet. But depending on who you're speaking to, if you show them the evidence, many people come to We have several books written by major scientists at the top of their fields in microbiology and astrophysics who are self-professed atheists when they write their books, and then they come out with a book later on and say, you know what, I've seen the new evidence and I've changed my mind. These are open-minded people. And I have tremendous respect for somebody who can do that. But there are many people who simply have a closed mind and refuse to, and I don't know why, for whatever reason. One last question.
Was it he who said it's easier to build a 747 in a junkyard during a hurricane than for evolution to create the DNA molecule?
Did you all hear that? I don't know who said it, but it's wonderful.